the second part of chapter 21. Now we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. All right, remember, monetary policy, some things that should come to mind right away are manipulating the money supply. Ben Bernanke, those 12 regional Fed banks. Well, now when we're talking about fiscal policy, what should come to mind? President and Congress, stimulus packages, the deficit and the debt. All of those things deal with fiscal policy. You might have heard this term used before for a fiscal year, and that's a term used to describe an accounting period. So, for example, the school year, we start in August and end in May, right? It's not a calendar year, but for a retailer, their busiest season might be Christmas time. So it doesn't make sense to start for accounting purposes in January and then end the budget right in the middle of the busy season. They'll, have it different than the calendar year for fiscal or for accounting purposes. All right, so fiscal policy is different than monetary policy. We're not talking about the money supply anymore. We're talking about spending and taxing by government policymakers. So just make a note to yourself, this is the President and Congress. They're the ones who are in charge of deciding where our money goes for a federal budget. Well, just like our graphs that we were just talking about, one represents expansionary monetary policy, Marshall's graph. Graph number 2 represents restrictive or contractionary monetary policy. We're trying to get people to spend less. We use fiscal policy in the same way. If we're trying to get people to spend more, how about the economy? We're going to shift aggregate demand to the right. And if we're trying to slow things down, we're going to shift aggregate demand to the left. How do we do that? Let's talk about expansionary fiscal policy first. If our goal is to shift aggregate demand to the right, the economy's not doing as well as we wanted it to. Well, let's say a lot of people are unemployed. Would this be the time to raise taxes? No. So that makes sense to decrease taxes. Now, why would we say an increase in government spending? If people aren't doing the spending, what's another way that we can increase aggregate demand? Have the government spend more on maybe roads, bridges, training programs, a lot of things that they can spend money on. See, if this is our goal, these are the 2 tools of fiscal policy. Remember your bonus from last time? How'd you write the 3 tools of monetary policy? So these are 2 tools of fiscal policy, spending and taxing. And this is how we'll use those 2 tools in each situation. With contractionary fiscal policy, so our goal is to try to slow down the economy, this is the time that we could increase taxes. This is the time that the government can cut back on spending. All right, so keeping that in mind, a song that many of you have heard before, Alabama's Song in the South. Here are the lyrics. I'll put this back up and let it play for a little bit. Y'all think, does this song talk about an example of expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy?
We all picked the cotton, but we never got rich. Daddy was a man trying to Southern Democrat. They only get a rich man that folk like that, singing song of the South, sweet potato pie and a shut my mouth. Gone with the wind. There ain't nobody looking back again. Wall Street fell, but we were so poor that we couldn't tell. Cotton was short and the weeds were tall, but Mr. Roosevelt had gonna save us all. Well, Mama got sick and Daddy got down. The county got the farm and they moved to town. Papa got a job with the TVA. We bought a washing machine and then a Chevrolet. Said, song of the South, sweet potato pie and shut my mouth. Gone with the wind, there ain't nobody looking back.
Okay, we can go ahead and stop it there. All right. What clues do we have in terms of what time period we're talking about here? Or the singer in the song? Okay, Wall Street fell, Roosevelt, so we're talking about the Great Depression, right? Things are really bad. They lost the farm, but then Dad got a job with the TVA. Who knows what that is?
Tennessee Valley Authority.
Tennessee Valley Authority, part of the New Deal. And part of Roosevelt's New Deal, so it was a big reforestation project. They built a lot of dams. This whole region, they were providing a lot of jobs for people. Right, and then obviously his family was better off now that his dad was working again. They were able to buy other things. Okay, what is that an example of? Expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy? Expansionary. Why? Who paid for all those programs that provided all those jobs?
Government.
It's definitely an example of increased government spending. So, expansionary fiscal policy. Who remembers getting a tax rebate check in the mail? Or your parents did, probably, from President Bush, W. Bush. Okay, that's an example of a decrease in taxes. Who recalls at the beginning of this year looking at your pay stub and your paycheck, and suddenly more payroll taxes have been taken out? Okay, that's an example of an increase in fiscal policy. Now, we've been hearing about in the news quite a bit about budget cuts and things like that. That's an example of decreased spending. So we hear about this, and y'all know examples of these things. We just probably shouldn't know the terms for it. All right, well, let's keep in mind expansionary fiscal policy. That was an example. So we said the two tools of expansionary fiscal policy include increased spending on a program like the TVA or cutting taxes. If the government were to decide to increase spending, and let's say we're going to spend some money on planes from Boeing, one thing that they have to remember is that there's going to be a multiplier effect on that government spending. How many of y'all have been skipping rocks before? And when the rock hits the water the first time, that's not the only effect on the water it has, right? Keeps going, you see lots and lots of ripples going out. Same thing, the initial government spending of $20 billion to Boeing, that's not the only impact on the economy it's going to have. How's Boeing going to fulfill all of those orders? They're going to have to buy the parts, they may need to hire some extra workers to fulfill those orders. Their suppliers are going to need to supply, if they don't have the inventory for it, they're going to need to buy more parts also. So you can think of this as the initial government spending. But when it's all said and done, if you take into consideration all of the ripple effects, this is the final impact on the economy. And so if we're going to not want to contribute to demand pull inflation in the future, we're going to make sure that we don't, shift aggregate demand out to the right too much, so we don't stimulate the economy too much. Just what it needs. And we have to keep this in mind with the multiplier effect. Another thing that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about expansionary fiscal policy is the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, this is just a fancy way of saying how likely are you to spend extra money. Pretend it's your birthday. Pretend today is your birthday and somebody gives you $100 in cash. And be honest, how many of you would spend all of your $100? Probably just spend all of it on something. Going out to eat, going shopping. Hey, how many of y'all would save all of it? Just put it away. you'd be disciplined enough to not touch it. A lot of y'all, but okay, and then the rest of y'all would save some, spend some. Okay, for those of you who said, I'm going to spend all of it, your marginal propensity to consume would be 100%. You spend all of it right away. Those of you who said you're going to save all of it, it would be 0. And then for the rest of you, whatever percentage that you're going to spend, let's say that you spent 80 of it and you saved 20 of it, then your marginal propensity to consume would be 0.8. You're not going to have to calculate this for me on a test, but just know that if the government were to provide a tax cut, like that rebate check that we got in the mail from George W. Bush, they're depending on us to do what with it? Spend it. What if our marginal propensity to consume is really low as a nation? What if we're really scared about the future? We don't know about our future incomes, not sure if we're going to get laid off? And that fiscal policy of, giving money back to people, lowering taxes, is going to be ineffective, right? Although, in real life in this country, I don't think we have to worry too much about people, saving all their money. Our savings rates are pretty low in this country. But, we do have to think about people's propensity or their probability of spending extra income if we're hoping that expansionary fiscal policy is going to be effective. And this is another thing that we have to think about with fiscal policy. Crowding out. All right, so this link up here, it says opposite direction, and down here it says the crowding out effect. Let me let you get that in your notes, and then we're going to switch over here to the document camera. There are actually a couple things we need to talk about when explaining crowding out. All right. Remember, with expansionary fiscal policy, we said that the government, in order to increase aggregate demand, can increase government spending or lower taxes. Right? Makes sense? All right. Well, where does the government get money to spend? Before that. Tax revenue. Where does the government get money to, build new bridges and roads? Tax revenue. Okay, well, if we're giving people tax rebates, we're not charging them as much income tax, giving tax credits, what are they going to have to do? Okay, Cynthia, what were you saying? You're going to have to borrow money. Yeah. If at some point the government doesn't have money to keep spending and they're running out of tax revenue, our federal government has to borrow money. Okay. This little graph isn't in our book, but you can think of it this way in terms of, okay, let's pretend this is tax revenue. And let's pretend this is, actually, let me change this. We're going to put spending over here, federal spending, and then we're going to put tax revenue over here. Okay, so this is money over here on the vertical axis, where this is low to high. And this is as a percentage of GDP, and this is going from low to high as usual. Okay, what do we call it when tax revenues are greater than the amount of expenditures? Would it be a surplus or deficit? If we've got more revenue than we're spending. Okay, this is the budget surplus over here. So draw a little smiley face. And this is, we're talking about the federal budget over here. Once we start spending more than we're bringing in terms of taxes, put a sad face over here. Got a deficit. How do we finance deficit spending? Maybe we've got some extreme situations like the government is really concerned about our economy. We've got widespread unemployment. It's not getting better. We have an argument for why we need to continue spending money. So sometimes we need to keep spending even though we have a deficit. Maybe we're at war, we've been attacked, maybe we've got terrible, terrible unemployment. So how do we meet this gap here? If we're spending this much, but we're only bringing this much in, and Cynthia said it, the federal government borrows money. How do they do that? By selling bonds. Okay, so I'm going to add this over here. To finance deficit spending. In some extreme instance where we need to keep spending for whatever reason, the federal government borrows money by selling bonds. Now we've talked about bonds before, and we talked about selling bonds just a few minutes ago. What did we say selling bonds does to the money supply? Decreases the money supply. And what does that do to interest rates? Remember our little acrostic, it's C dog run, it raises interest rates. Okay, now hold on, what does raising interest rates do to aggregate demand? How do we expect people to behave when interest rates are higher? Buy less. So this could decrease aggregate demand. Now wait a minute, what was our original purpose? To expand the economy. We did all of this to increase aggregate demand, right? Okay, so this crowding out idea is talking about when our original plan of trying to stimulate the economy could possibly backfire on us if we have to borrow money to do it. And it's crowding, so government borrowing starts crowding out private investment when we see interest rates start to rise. So you can think of this, when our policy actually has the opposite direction of what we originally intended, that's our plan backfire on us. And that's one possible thing that we need to think about if we're going to continue borrowing, as when I say we, I mean the federal government. All right. I'm going to switch over to a video, and then we'll finish our slides.